Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt. After last episode on the history and all the svarim available on Hilchas Gittin, my mind was blown. I may have shared, maybe I should share. I took some notes, and the amount of svarim and literature that you quoted was just beyond. So we want to continue. We want to focus on one specific sefer/book. It's called the Kutzo Shel. It was written by a maskil whose name was Yalag. Rabbi Brot will tell us what that stands for. And it was written as a vicious attack on a tremendous, one of the Gedolei Hadar of that time, who Rabbi Brot is very into. I don't like calling him that, but one of Rabbi Brot's heroes. And we're going to hear about him as well. This episode has also been sponsored anonymously. I see Rabbi Brot's Hasidim like to live Batznei Alachas Hashem Alekecha. So thank you to that anonymous sponsor for sponsoring this episode. Without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Eliezerbrodt, what do you have in store for today?
Okay, so basically we are going, as you said, we're going to continue sort of with what we began the last episode. In the last episode, we ran through some of the svarim on Gittin, especially this, also with focus on svarim relating to the names or how to spell names. And through this episode, we're going to be able to go back to the svarim, some of those svarim. It's going to play out in this episode, a deep dive to see what the makairis are of the svarim that are when svarim are written on the names of Gittim. Where were they relying on? What were their makairis? It's going to play out in this story that we're going to discuss. And basically, the story we're going to begin is we're going to say the story very briefly, and then we're going to go into all of the various pratim. The story is like this: there was a Jew. His name was Yehuda Leib Gordon, and we're going to discuss him momentarily. And basically, in 1875, he publishes, even though there's a better word for it, we're going to call it a poem. It's a long, long poem, but it's a story in the poem. And in the story, there's a whole story and a bunch of sub-stories relating to a couple, two couples actually. And basically, what happens is that she's supposed to get a get. They're waiting for a get, and it comes up with how to spell the name Hillel. It plays out in the story, we'll discuss exactly what it says in this poem and what he writes as his sources for it. That will be that's the story. We'll discuss more about what the story is, and then after that, we'll see what he brought in his poem. Even he brings the svarim that we mentioned last week, and we'll be able to see more about it, how it plays out with Hillel, what he was talking about. Okay, so let's go like this. Number one is, I begin with Yalag. Yalag is a person born in Vilna in the early 1830s, and he dies in 1892. The Kutzo, today, at least in the Frum world, many people never heard of him, but in those days, he was beyond famous. So now the question is, how does he become famous? Basically, he was one of these people that wrote a lot. He wrote all types of stuff. He wrote poetry, and he wrote articles of all types in all the different newspapers, mostly in Hebrew, but also in Russian. At the time, he was a very big spokesperson. He had a lot to say. Today, we would call him he would be similar to a very big blogger. He would be a blogger, tumbling about all the different things, the hot issues of the day. Now, it doesn't mean to say that there were a lot of issues in those days, just like there's always issues. And he spoke about it sometimes very harshly. He was critical of a lot of different things that were going on in that period of time. Now, to just give a drop of background to understand this like this, he was born in Vilna, I said. So now he learns by a Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhiner for the first few years. His father sends him off in Vilna. He gets tutored. He gets a tremendous knowledge of Tanakh and Diktuk. Okay. Now, we know, besides for the various...
Just to clarify, he was born Shomer Shabbos because he said he got knowledge of Tanakh and Diktuk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm going to explain in a second. We're going to give exactly what's going on. So he's born in Vilna, as I said, and in 1830s, and he's from at this point. His father was from, and he gets a real from upbringing. He goes to cheder, a traditional cheder. Very good you're pointing this out. It's very, very important. He goes to traditional cheder, and as I said, his tutor was a frum and very chashuv, a prominent Talmud of Reb Chaim Volozhin that was a known tutor in the time. It seems his father at that time did have a little money, so he was able to send him dafka to this tutor. And because of this, he got a very solid early on education based on Talmidei Hagra, Reb Chaim Volozhin, which was that, amongst other things, is to know Tanakh well. So he didn't just learn Chumash well, he learned Tanakh well, and he also learned the Hebrew language diktuk also. Not that he didn't learn anything else, but the point was this helped him, give him a strong background, which we know the Gra held very strongly of, like the Mishnah Novis, that's how the education system's supposed to be. You first master Tanakh before you're moving on to Gemara. So he gets this very strong background at a young age from a very prominent person at the time. A prominent person that knew how to teach Talmidim very well. Okay, basically, there are different descriptions. A lot has been written about this Yalag, but interestingly, he wrote a lot of letters. Amongst everything else that he wrote, he had letters, correspondences of different people. So in a letter, which seems to be that he's like being very pessimistic about people that write autobiographies, I guess the guy asked him to give him his life history. So he, in a cynical way, he was a very cynical person, he gives his autobiography of his early years, but it's also been in other places also it seems that this is all true. So he talks about what I just mentioned, that he gets this learning. He learns Tanakh very well, but he also learns Gemara very, very well for many years. What I mean many years is, let's say from the age of 9, he says that at the age of 13 he already finished the Bavis very well, and he knew hundreds of block Gemara. They thought he was going to be a great guy. Supposedly, the person that raised him as a little kid met him later on in life, and she saw him. He, at that time, he was already a famous poet and writer, and she's all upset, saying, "We thought you're going to be a gadol, and this is what you become, poet and everything." And he's all proud of himself that he became a poet and everything. Anyway, make a long story short, what the significance over here is he has a upbringing in when by the time he's 17, he basically has finished Shas. He's learned in yeshivas and everything. Like many other, not yeshivas, but in the Kloisen, in the various places in Vilna. So he has. So what's important over here is that, and it's not always emphasized, is he has a real background, which a lot of times maskilim did not necessarily have real backgrounds. Especially, he has a serious background in learning, and that's how he enhances it by learning other languages and everything. But he knew Tanakh very well, and he was very good with languages, and he knew. At least he learned at one point in his life Shas. And the point is, with that, he was able to he's using this in his various writings when he's attacked. He's a learned person. Again, learned is obviously relative. We're not talking about that he's Adam Gadol or going up against the Gadol, such as the person he's going up against a lot of the times is Rebbe Yosef Zechariah Stern, but he's a knowledgeable person. He's not Amoritz. That's the key words. He's not Amoritz, because sometimes he'll say, what did I have to say? So he's able to. It makes it much worse. He's an evil. In a way, these type of people are much worse because they're educated, so they know how to find what to harp on, and then they could make a whole thing from that. So anyway, there's a lot to discuss about Haskalah at that time, Haskalah in Vilna as opposed to Haskalah of Germany. What the difference is that we're not trying to conquer Kala Torah Kula of this sugya and this era in such a short period of time in this short episode. We're just trying to give a small taste. The point I'm trying to bring out is he was a learned person. That's all. Now, eventually, he gets exposed to Haskalah, like the typical story which happened to many, many people in Lita, hiding various literatures. He's exposed to the earlier Maskilim in Vilna, which many of them were actually from Shomer Torah Mitzvahs people at the time, especially the first generation of Maskilim in Vilna. He was also exposed this through a brother-in-law. His sister married a guy that was sitting and learning for a bunch of years. This guy was also learned, but he already had a Pesach. He was getting involved with these early Maskilim, and what they were doing is they would be hiding literatures of different things under their Gemara, and the story that you always hear about is a typical story also plays out with him. Anyway, point is, he gets exposed to everything, but the difference between him and many others is he becomes famous. One of the most famous people in that period of time. For the next 50, 60 years, he's one of the people, all the newspapers, he's always getting involved with everything. Okay, now when I say a poem, when he writes a poem, so you think like this boring little poem. Sometimes when you read poems, depending on your education, so You're like, okay, I don't even understand the word, what this poet is even trying to say. Here, in this poet, it's very well written. It gives a very good portrayal of life at the time. And Bechlal, it's using, he's a person that's growing up in Vilna and Lita, so he knows, he's not like talking about something that didn't happen or whatever. He knows the background, he knows all the different minhagim, and everything's being thrown in to this piece that he uses over here and many other pieces of his. And it's not a short little poem. There's a version on the internet one could find. With the English translation, obviously it's big letters, but it's many pages to publish. If someone wants to print out the whole story, this whole poem, because it's really a story with all different things, it's long. And we're not going to discuss all the different aspects. There are actually books written on this, articles written on this. This has been discussed for years and years. This basically made him, once he published this poem in 1875 in the pretty much evil, I would call it evil journal called Hashachar. It's been discussed endlessly. Now, there's a person that devoted a lot of time, wrote a book called "For Whom Do I Toil?" Judah Leib Gordon and the Crisis of Russian Jewry, Michael Stanlowski. So he wrote a whole fancy book a bunch of years back, Mamish, Dairish, everything about Gordon and all his writings he went through in Hebrew, Yiddish, and Russian also. Anyway, basically he talks about all. The Kutzo, the point is, we won't read the quotes, but the point is that this poem becomes a very, very, everyone's reading it now. And I'm going to quote more. I'm going to give you a background what the story is in a second. But the point is, he's using it to discuss life in Lita, very vivid, and he's also discussing a problem at the time, which is the plight of the woman. Women weren't educated at this period of time in the 1870s, so he's harping on that aspect, throwing that in, how hard it is for women, from women, how they got to do everything, and he's also harping on, in the story, this lady, she's a very special lady. She gets married to a Matsuyan at the time. Her father wants her to marry Matsuyan, who ends up going to learn Volozhin for a few years, so everyone's like all jealous of her, and you could see from all different things he's harping on, he's trying to poke at, in a cynical way, making fun of the way of life that was going on, but he's using it in what he calls l'shem shamayim, because he's trying to bring out the plight of the lady. One of the ways that maskilim were very fond of, and a lot of it sparked from this poem actually, is to harp on the shvera sugya, which Paiskim lost sleep over, and anyone familiar with the world of halacha and the sugya of agunas, this is a terrible situation, how to be mater agunas in all the different situations that they found themselves over the years. It's a complex sugya. So he, being the critical, I guess we'll use evil, but I'm not going to say evil, because in some way he had some good intentions with it. But the point is that he's harping on these things that he's a learned person, knows about, to bring out this point of the how a woman could become an aguna, even from where a get was actually given. Okay, so now what's the story? What does he say? Basically, this someone gets involved. It turns out that this husband ran away. He's living in Liverpool, and so a man gets involved in Vilna. He pays off. Turns out her husband's willing to give a get if he pays a few hundred dollars. So he does that without her knowing. So again, obviously he's trying to bring out a point with that aspect. Kutzo, they're waiting for the get to come, and basically I think the point was he's going to end up marrying this woman after she gets the get. He was from Yid. They're just waiting for a get. What happens? So the way the story goes, as Yalag writes, B'yoyim harishon l'seidim nitzavim, the Rav and his Dayanim are waiting. They open up the letters to see the get, that everything should be written properly, waiting from Liverpool. Fine, the shliach comes, and then what happens? What goes wrong? Hold on. What goes wrong is I lost the paper. Hold on. Yeah. Bekitzer, they check and they see how the word Hillel is spelled. And it says like this. The get is, Hillel is spelled without a yud. Dainu it's chaser. So the dayan, one dayan who's a makubal, this is how Yalag writes it, makubal yodei achein hichlit al pi ha'ari. Ki Hillel nichtiv chaser. That's the right way. So it's a good get. Gama sheni, the other dayan says al pi bedek abayis. Amar kain. Also the bedek abayis says Hillel is spelled with chaser over here. V'shneim gilu daitim ki aget kosher. Everything's kosher v'yosher. Ach rav vafsi hichlit ki Hillel male. No, Hillel is spelled with hey yud lamed lamed. So kidas hazam vasam al pi shulchan aruch. This is a line from Yalag. I'll be the Zam and the Sam. Who's the Zam and the Sam? The Yerubam v'yomer ki be'einav yifale ich shachu gashneim psak dinarach v'chein amar adaitam, and he said Chaval, the get's puzzle, and the point was this husband just died in a boat accident right before. So if this get would have been good, it would have been great. So he couldn't even go get a new get to write Hillel. I'll be this thing, tragic story, blah blah. Okay, fine. But the point is, the key thing is what this learned maskil brings in the middle, Harizal, the Bedek Habayis, and the Zam and the Sam. I'll be the Shulchan Aruch. Okay, now, so we'll get shortly. We'll get back to that. The point is that the rabbi that he's sort of making fun of, he admitted it openly and everything, was Tayyid Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern. So who's Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern? That we'll discuss him briefly right now, and then we'll get back to the story of how to spell Hillel. So Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern, Mamish is this come out the same age. He's born the same time as Yalag, 1831, 1903. He lives a little longer than Yalag, and he's a great guy, and his father was a great guy, and his father seems to be his main Rebbe. His father dies young. Anyway, he marries the daughter of Rav Gimpel Yafi. Rav Gimpel Yafi is one of the Talmidim of Hakim of Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhiner, and a great guy in his own right. Anyway, the Kutzo eventually he's a Rav. He becomes a Rav at 20, which is not so common, but by the age of 30, he gets a Steller in Shavel, and he remains the Rav there for 40 years. It's very unheard of for a Rav to become the Rav in a city like Shavel. It's one of the biggest. It's a city. It's not a shtetla, and he's there for 40 years. Basically, he had a miserable life there. They weren't happy with him. He wasn't happy with them, but he stayed there. He was mamish in poverty the whole time. There's documented articles about how miserable it was for him over there with the salaries, the various fights that he had with the different people in the Kehilas. And he was a very sick person. Health-wise, he most of the time had to be confined to his bed. He wasn't able to down with in the minyanim, giving shiurim all the time. But he was available to answer questions, and he definitely answered questions, as we're going to see in a moment. Now, so just first to discuss Rabbi Zechariah for a minute, and then we'll discuss some eyewitness accounts with him, and then we'll get to move on. Basically, this Rabbi Zechariah Stern is beyond prolific. Already at the young age, he publishes a sefer on Ha'aros on Shas, not on all of Shas, mostly Moed Masechtas, but I suspect he also wanted to show that he's not just a Moed guy. He throws in a nice amount of material on Yavamas. This sefer is his first publication when he's very young. And basically people that look at it were blown away at the time. And I'm going to explain to you why they were blown away. But just to note, Rabbi Yaakov Gesundheit, the author of the Tveres Yaakov, who we spoke about in the first episode of Masechtas Gittin Bechlal, one of the great Gedolim of the time, he was not the type of person that praised people so fast. He writes, he speaks to him, he sees him, he says, he's blown away by his Charifus Ubekiyas B'Yama Talmud, Bavli Yerushalmi, Tosefta im Kola Paiskin, the Chuvas Mefarshim Kadmayu Basrai. Now, just understand, this is no exaggeration. This was a person that was a walking encyclopedia, knew everything published at the time. And you follow and you read Dov Berish Meisels, a great guy in himself, worthy of his own discussion. He says, I spoke to this Rabbi Zechariah. I'm blown away by him. And it seems he had many more askamas in his svarim, but he didn't publish them, whatever reason. Anyway, he writes on everything, literally on everything. So much so that a problem that many people had in general is you could write a lot, but you need to get funding. This is a problem out of Yom. You have to you could write as much as you want, but you got to get funding to publish what you have. So he was always looking for someone to fund his materials. In the back of his chuvas, so he puts out 4 volumes on Orach Chaim. He's successful in publishing it. So at the back of one point, he gives a list of what he has Ha'aros on, and he's willing to give it away for free, whoever's willing to publish it in their own svarim. What's the topics? You have to hear this list. He goes, Hagoyis al kol shas bavli, daf al daf. That means on every page he has Ha'aros. Yerushalmi, Mishnayos, Tosefta, Bahag. Then he has special long Tyrus. Then he has Yeridea, Rambam, Sefer HaMitzvos, Kol Dal Chelkei Shulchan Aruch. Then he has a chibur about halachas that are important for Paiskim. Then he has Ha'aros on all of Medrash Rabbah, Tanchuma, Shachar Toiv, Tehillim, Mishlei, Medrash Shmuel, Psikta, Rev Tuvia, Medrash Tadshe, Tandi Belio, Lambez Midas, and the Aruch. This is all him talking. Then he says, I have a chibur on Sugyas Uklali Shas. And in this, I have a whole chibur about the Shemes Tanoi V'Amaram, more than 160 names that I got from all different places in Shas to answer up all types of steers. Besides all this, I have a chibur gadol on all of Tanakh. Al pi pshat, I have Haggayis on the Mar Nevuchim Ikrim Chavos Halvavos, the Bechinas Olam, and other Svarim. I have Haggayis on the Sefer Chasidim, Mifra Pninim, Shir, Reb Shimon Gamliel. You get the point. Piyutim, Kachim, Tyra, Shem Agdoilim, whatever you want. But Kitzer, this guy has Ha'aris and Tyra on everything. Now, so you'll say he's exaggerating. Let me tell you, my friend, you spend 5 minutes with any 2 pages in any of his svarim, and you will see something you never saw in your life before. What he's bringing the literature from literally everywhere in Kol Torah Kula. He knows everything. He knows Haskalah literature also. He knows every newspaper article at the time. It's like he read an article, he was able to quote it. The stories go that when the Meicher Svarim would come to sell Svarim in Shavel, so sometimes he would look at a sefer and then he would go to the guy, here's the money. So he'd say, okay, here, take the sefer. He goes, no, I finished the sefer. I don't need the sefer, but I read your sefer, so I have to pay you money for it. And this happened not once, not twice, and you could see, it's clear that he had a complete, total recall from his stuff. It seems at one point there was a fire, and the fire destroyed a lot of his stuff. He rewrote it. Now, a lot of it, Baruch Hashem, survived, and it's in different places. But Mechon Yerushalayim, we have to give them unbelievable credit. Many years ago, and this Tshuva Sefer is going to play significant to our story, he publishes only Dalach Halakim on Aruch Chaim. What about the rest of Shulchan Aruch? So, Even Ezer, Mechon Yerushalayim published many years ago.
What are these Tshuvas called?
Tshuva Zecher Yosef. And then more recently, they redid the Aruch Chaim Tshuvas, and then they published for the first time from manuscript Yeridea. So first, Even Ezer is from manuscript. Aruch Chaim they redid with new materials, and Yeridea is all new material. So they printed 5 volumes of this great guy. He also wrote on Haggadah Shel Pesach. It was published, fascinating Haggadah. He has on the Megillus, unbelievable, and he's holding in everything. What I mean is he knows history. He knows every. I have lists just of the svarim that he quotes. Every time I look at him, I'm like, oh my gosh, he knows this, he knows that, everything. Anyway, point is, one of his most unique chiburim was something called Maimer Taluches Haggados. This is a mind-blowing work, kedai to learn. It's published in the back of his volume, the 4th volume on Aruch Chaim. For some reason, Mechon Yerushalayim didn't want to reprint it. I suspect there's a few reasons behind it. I actually spoke to them, trying to get them to do it. Maybe they would do it. In the end, they don't think they're going to do it. It's a lot of time to do. I have a chalaim to do such a thing, but my chalaim is a greater chalaim. And that relates, again, I'm going to see how it plays out in our story. He used to write in the newspapers at the time, pages and pages, like all different issues. He wrote tyrus. So I always wanted to collect all the materials that are found in these newspapers. And they're talking about hundreds and hundreds of articles. So a few years back, a professor took on a certain topic, which we're going to discuss very shortly, some of it, a few hundred pages, and it was published. This is not found in your local Svarim store, so I just have to show the picture. It's called Bekishvuni Shel Pulmus. Prakim Besafruta Pulmus Bein Rabbanim Umaskilim Belita B'Mea Chasre. Here, this fellow, this academic, his name is Yuda Friedlander, Bar Ilan Press publishes it, went and got, at least in one sugya, numerous newspaper articles that Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern wrote in defense against the Maskilim, which we'll discuss momentarily. Point is, beyond prolific. Okay, now, so why does he pick Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern? So this is a question which Halavai, we had a great answer. It seems he knew him, he didn't like him. Maybe there was even a personal story that because of the personal story that bothered him. Because it's unclear why he chose Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern. At least that's what a lot of the people that discussed the topic said. There's one of the not academic, but a very fine collection of material on Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern is from a Yid Rabbiner. And he wrote collected of all different materials relating to Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern. So, Bekitzer, it seems that at one point they asked Yalag, did you mean Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern? Yes. Why? Okay, he didn't give a good answer. He asked him, and not only that, they asked him, you know that Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern is not the way you're portraying him. And he said, yeah. So why did you pick Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern to make fun of? So he said, a poet doesn't write history. So he was admitting, so to speak, that it doesn't have to, not everything has to be accurate. So even though the life that he's portraying and the issues he's trying to bring out, and not only that, we're going to see the sources he's using about the spelling of Hillel is accurate, but the story didn't happen. So that's part of what a novel writer, so to speak, is. And this is a novel in the sort of a poem. So he was admitting it. But the point is, something triggered that he did not like Rabbi Zechariah Stern. I think the answer is very simple. I basically just alluded to it. Rabbi Zechariah Stern was one of the Gedolim. There's different approaches how to deal with evil people, with maskilim. And when I mean these maskilim, I'm going to explain to you why they're evil. Some of these maskilim, especially at this time, they wrote in the newspapers. The newspapers was becoming a very big thing at this period of time, and they would attack Yiddishkeit openly, viciously. Now, who's reading newspapers? Everyone. You say they're the blogs of those days. So these maskilim would take, some of them were learned, they would take certain things and they would write, a few different pieces. And now if you have a regular Joe Schmo with not a proper learning or not he reads this article, he doesn't know that this guy might be making up something or who knows what. And it could cause tremendous, the fallout could be terrible. So there's different approaches. So sometimes you'll find that Gedolim say, we don't say anything, we don't get involved, we're not going to help anything anyway. At that time, many Gedolim felt yes to answer them. And there was an attack in those years, starting in 1869. One of the great maskilim at that time, when I say great, I don't mean that he was a great person. He was just a famous maskil. Also someone that was originally yeshiva trained, but I don't think he was anything close to as good as Gordon, but also vicious person. His name is Moshe Lillenbaum. And Moshe Lillenbaum literally sits and attacks Shulchan Aruch and Halacha with tons of examples for pages and pages in newspapers. So the rabbi said, no. We're going to respond. Who was one of the main people that responded to this fight? Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern. And he answers him viciously. Now, the problem is that if you see how Rabbi Zechariah Stern writes and you're a regular Amoritz, you're not going to really understand Rabbi Zechariah Stern's answer because he's just throwing Kala, Torah, Kula all over the place. Lillenbaum understood. And the intellectuals understood, but the maskil, the regular Joe Schmo who's reading it, he's like, look, the rabbis were attacked about this minig, that it's baloney or whatever, which is a lot of times what happens. When the uneducated get involved in the playing field, so it becomes the mikvanayis and the tumult in the shul, and the rabbi doesn't know what he's talking about. Anyway, so it gets to the rabbanim at the time got involved and they wrote major responses, and I think that was one of the reasons he was really picking on him. Now, but it happens to be that Yalag wrote a ton and he attacked plenty of rabbanim, and he attacked Rabbi Zechariah Stern in another place. And he has in one of his essays, he attacks a bunch of rabbanim, and he gives a bunch of different stories, and different things bothered him. Lamashal, there's a whole deal about Kitnius. Kitnius always played out in Klal Yisrael, but there were times that literally people didn't have what to eat, and still certain rabbanim were very machmir about it. For whatever reasons, this is a very complex sugya which is worthy to go through a different time. He was fire against, in certain periods of time, people were bamish dying, so he would write in the press, and he wasn't the only maskil. They really led battles fighting what's going on at the time. Okay, anyway, make a long story short, so this Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern is this this tremendous guy in Olam, and sadly, what's his name? Yalag decides to pick on him in this thing that basically becomes very famous with him. Now, I'm just going to quote three sources about this, and then we'll get into how to spell Hillel to go further into the story. So first of all, Lamashal, the Sri Dayesh, he has a beautiful piece somewhere in one of his articles where he talks about, he says, Lamaisa, Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern, who won out? He says, Pashat, who's more famous today? No one knows who Yalag is. Whereas Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern, Goyin Nifla, everyone knows, you look at his Svarim, Adayoim, he's the man, and Yalag, no one heard of, no one's Isaac in him today, which is true. Pretty much, I'm saying if you take a poll, not that many people know who Yalag is. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that fascinating encounter, and this gives a little, I'm just quoting it because it gives a little bit about a live account of Rabbi Zechariah Stern, and there are many, but this one is like this. There's a Yid Ben Sion Dinar. We're not going to get into him, but he learned in Telz basically, and then he goes off and he becomes a professor in Hebrew University. Kitzer, when he's leaving Telz on the way, so in those days, they would go visit Gedolim on the way, just to see. So he goes with his brother to visit, and they pop in by Rabbi Zechariah Stern. And I told you Rabbi Zechariah Stern was a Yid that was sick, and he didn't really speak to people. He barely down with minyan and everything, but they decided they're going to get in, and they told the people around them, please let us in to see Rabbi Zechariah Stern. And Lamaisa, it seems they caught him in a good mood. Where are you coming from? He says, from Telz. So he goes, okay, what shir did he learn? So he says to them, so what did you learn there? What did you learn? Did you learn any Gemara? Obviously, he's making fun of because, okay. Now, then he says, how many blot did you learn in your life? He's obviously making fun of because it's known. Yeshiva Bachrim, a lot of times they learn more Be'iyun. So they said, no, we learned a lot. Now, he didn't want to say that he learned a lot. It happens to be Ben Sion Dinar learned a crazy amount, over 1,000 blot, but he did not want to discuss that. I guess possibly he was scared is that maybe Zechariah is going to start to faher. Anyway, Kitzer, they have a whole conversation, and they start talking lumdis, and then he asks him, do you look at all in the Maseres HaShas when you're learning? Then it somehow comes up, do you learn the Darim? Did you learn the Darim with the Ran? Okay, the whole time, and he makes fun of them again for being Isaac Alan Dixais. Anyway, but they said they end up talking a lot and learning. He's very happy with them, and the point was that the people around him were very impressed. He said Rabbi Zechariah Stern was usually very sick and he's very schwach, but he felt he wanted to give chizuk to these yeshiva bachrim. So he was in a good mood, and they had a great time. They had a great conversation, and it had a major impact on his Ben Sion Dinar. And so much so, he said that when he read the Kutzo Shel Yud of Yalag, he felt very bad because he saw Rabbi Zechariah Stern live, and he saw that it's mamish not true at all. Rabbi Zechariah Stern is not that rough. But we're going to see soon how far baloney Yalag was in this prat with Rabbi Zechariah Stern. Okay, I just will one last prat about this with the Kutzo Shel Yud is I mentioned already a few times that I was able to publish a work, collected all the writings of a Yid, Moshe Reines, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak Reines, who died sadly at the age of 20. I spent time and I collected his many writings. This young 20-year-old wrote, you could see this amount of material and more by the time he was 20. I collected it from all over the world, different places, stuff that was published in newspapers and letters that were in different archives. Anyway, but Kutzer, he writes, he also was very busy dealing with the clash of Haskalah. Any good from Haskalah, bad from Haskalah, not for now. And he writes also that even though the Kutzo Shel Yud, it hurts when you read it, but there's a lot of fascinating information in the Kutzo Shel Yud. And he actually has letters with Gordon, which I published here that I found. And in these letters, he you could see that already at that time there's a Seif Yamav of Gordon, which it sounds like he's not from, but he says in Deus we might be similar, but Avada not in Frumkeit. Reines is writing about himself that I'm makbid on Kol Tag of Shulchan Aruch. Okay, anyway, okay, so now, so we've given some type of very rough portrait of these two figures. Obviously, there's a lot behind them, a lot to discuss more, but we're not trying to do Kol Torah Kula al Regel Achas, as I said already. So now what is that I'm trying to do is the story. What's the sources for, I said he quotes Rizal, the Bedek Habayis, the Zam, and the Sam. What's the sources for Yalag in this poem? Okay. So last time we mentioned like this, that there's various chiburim on Hilchas Gittin. So if one opens up the Shulchan Aruch and you want to know how do you spell Hillel, so it says like this. It's often a Sif Chav Ches and Simon Kuf Chav Tes. Yesh Mishayim Yesh L'Kaisvai Mali Biyud. The Ramah brings down the Chain Yesh L'Chtov B'Kol Kiyot B'Zeh. Afal Pisha Dina L'Chtov Chaser Eine Mazik and Kasei Mali. Okay, so it sounds like from the Ramah you could hear either way, and Mechaver brings down a Yesh Mishayim that you should write it Mali. Now, everyone knows when you want to learn the Mechaber, what do? You open up the Beis Yosef. It says in Beis Yosef, he says Matzasi Kasov. I found the Yesh the Kaisvei Mali Biyod. Even though the Besefer Shoftim, it says in Pasuk Avdun ben Hillel, and it says over there in the Messiah. It says the lashon is like this: "Hamasayris kaser sham less chaser mashma shemidina yesh liyos malei adkan." So he's bringing down a source, and what's the source? So it turns out, last week, and I'm going to explain what it says in this source also. I'm not just going to read it. Last week we said Hilchos Gittin, the father of Hilchos Gittin, so to speak, of these type of pratim was a Yid Reb Yaakov Margolis. The Ramah based a lot of his material off the Sefer, quoting summations at the end of in Hilchos Gittin, calling it the Seder Haged of Reb Yaakov Margolis, and this is the go-to Sefer for the starting point in all the Svarim. Now, does the Beis Yosef have the Sefer? It seems pretty much that he does not. Somehow he had this piece. Wash date over here. So it says Hillel in the Sefer. You spell it Hillel. Now the Sefer Seder Haget Rabbi Yaakov Margolis had another part, Yam Sha'asa Shloima, and over there's a Haggah, and the Haggah is quoted from the Maril, and it goes like this: how do you spell Hillel? Male or Chaser? Dining with a Yud, without a Yud. So now this gets to the heart of the topic that we're talking about. How does any Paisik in those days, how did they know how to spell something? Right now we have often a machlokes here in Shulchan Aruch, right? The Beis Yosef says Yesh Mishayim Yesh L'Kais V'Mali Yud. Okay, so what do you do? So obviously we have a book called Tanakh. So we open up our Tanakh to see if we could find anywhere where it says Hillel. So we find there's a pasuk in Shoftim, Parak Yud Beis, pasuk Yud Gimel, and then again in pasuk Tesvav. It says, "Vayishbad Achav of Yisrael, Avgoin ben Hillel." How is it spelled? So you open up your standard thing. It says Hillel Chaser. So what happens? The Maril brings down. It says B'Shem the Maril in this Haggah from Yaakov Margolis. B'Sefer Shoftim Matzina Hillel B'Lo Yud Chaser. Okay, great. So that's how you would say you should spell it. Always chaser, often a pasuk in Shoftim. What more do you need? But there's a thing called the Messiah. Okay, this causes problems, and because of that, all Hillels should be spelled with a yud. This pasuk in Shoftim is chaser. Obviously, what am I talking about? Messiah. What happens? I'm saying Chinese. I'm going to get to this and explain this more in a second. So basically, what comes out from this Rabbi Yaakov Margolis, how would you spell Hillel based on this Maril? Male. Then he goes on and says like this: Remez Hillel b'soif hachumish Moshe le'enei kol Yisrael. How do we? There's a remez how to spell Hillel from the end of the Torah. What does it say at the end of the Torah? Le'enei kol Yisrael. Soif tevois Hillel b'yud. Wow. Also, it says El Mul Pnei Amanoira Yiru Shivas Aneris Soif tevois Hillel b'yud. Kiloimar halacha kebeis Hillel. Hillel male b'yud. So you're seeing that there's one raya is based on the Messiah, which we're going to explain what that means in a second. Another raya is these funny type of ramazim that a Litvak would say, this is what you hear at a Hasidic Torah, this is going to be the way you're going to pass a get, how to spell a get. Very strange. Okay. We open up, but the point is, as I state in Rabbi Yaakov Margolis.
I'm sure those who are learning Daf Yomi may have heard the whole source for 12 lines in a get comes from like Tosfos on the first daf in Masechtas Gittin. The 12 lines get is gematria 12. Tosfos has another pshat. It's the amount of space between all the Chamisha Kumshei Torah, how they're separated. Besides for Dvarim, 4 lines between the 3 separations is 12. So
correct.
We see this connection already.
Right, but the shaila are you the shaila, which also plays out over there, is it going to passel the get? Over here, we're seeing that the Paiskim are going to go ad klikach to passel a get that's spelled Hillel wrong because of such a type of thing. Okay, now
100%. It's fascinating.
Now the Beis Yosef. So we said the Beis Yosef brings down Matzasi Kasef. So it's a Maril. How he had the Maril, I don't have the answer to. No one has an answer for that question, but he had it somehow. Then he says in his Bedek Habayis, what's that? That's Ha'aris that he later incorporated, Ha'aris that he had after publishing. Ein Dvarim nearly, it's wrong. The Adrab, Misham Raya, the Hachi Perusha, Les Hillel b'Mikra Kim Zeh, Vaydi Shehu Chaser v'Kam Mishpatoi. That Gufa from this pasuk we learn there's no other Hillels, and the way one should spell it is Chaser. Like it is over there. I mean to say, there's a dion how to understand the Messiah. Okay, so I keep on saying the word Messiah. Without further ado, let me just give a drop of background, then we can understand the more of the story. I apologize. It's with the pages floating all over the place. Okay, like this. So there's a Naisa called Messiah. And we're not attempting today, right now, in these few minutes left to go through all the aspects of what the Messiah is. We're just going to quote a Lashon. Basically this is from Yisrael Yabin, one of the world experts of the past generation of the Messiah. What is it? He says like this: Messiah mareches hayrois hamshamoshes l'shmira al tzuras ksivas v'nuschoch shel mikra. How do you preserve the Torah? How do we know the exact way how to spell everything? Kriyu ksiv l'mashal, everything in the Torah over the centuries. How is it preserved that we have it the way it was all the way back? Kedushasai shel mikra, and how all the tliya halachas from kol tag shebet tag. How was this preserved? The answer is through the Messiah. It was a special listing, and they would tell us, let's say Hillel, how to spell Hillel, and many such things. David is David with a Yud. And in Hilchas Gittin, it turns out that one has to have major knowledge of Messiah. And that's the way, if the word has it in the Messiah, you find it in Tanakh, you have to obviously know Tanakh. You open up your Tanakh and you would see how it's spelled there. Now, fine, great. So now, but what's coming out is that there's a machlokes how to learn the Messiah. This is how the Messiah wasn't such an open shut sugya. As a matter of fact, if you go over to a Yid today and you say, I want to learn the Messiah, I want to see the Messiah, what's it even referring to? Not so easy. You're not going to be able to get a good answer to that question. And we're going to discuss a little bit about this, but we're not going to have a good answer for that now. That's its own separate episodes, not nigga. But the point is, over here, you're seeing right away that the way Rabbi Yaakov Margolis is bringing down B'Shem the Maril, one way how to understand the Messiah, and the Beis Yosef is coming out a completely different way how to understand this two words in the Messiah. And what's coming out is that, do we learn from the Messiah you spell Hillel Chaser or Malay? That's how shver it is in these two words. It could go either way. Fine. Make a long story short, there's a lot to say, as I said, a lot of Ramazim. Now, let's look at the Marshal Mashal. So we said the Yamshel Shleima is published later on, so it couldn't play a role at this time, but actually here it does. He says like this. He says, on one hand, I find Hillel Malay. Another place, it says Hillel Chaser. And then he brings Sefer Shaiftim. And he says like this, maybe you'll tell me you could bring a raya from the Gemaras, how it spells Hillel, and we'll get back to that also. It says, no, you can't bring a raya from Tfus. Okay, we'll discuss that more soon. Then he brings down this whole discussion that we brought down from Yaakov Margolis. He has it from a Maril, how to learn the Pshat in the Messiah relating to Parsha Shaiftim. Shaiftim in the Navi. Okay, and he also rather brings down the other Ramazan that I said some cynic would say it sounds like Hasidic Torah. Okay, so Marshal is also bringing it down. Fine. Anyways, Bekitzer, as you go through all the Paiskim, you'll see everyone's bringing this down. The Beis Shmuel, just to quote the Beis Shmuel like this. We said the Beis Shmuel he became the go-to sefer. What happened is that he used previous literature that was out there. He got and then he made like sort of an encyclopedia, and you'll see in Shulchan Aruch after in Siman Kuf Chav Tes a listing of how to spell all the names, and he writes his sources. So we'll read the entry of Hillel. He says, how do you spell Hillel? B'Yud, Kefisha Pasuk B'Shulchan Aruch. Elm Kain Diyesh Kabbalah Lichtov Chaser. Unless you have a Kabbalah that you spelled your name Hillel Chaser. Then he says, Ubes Sefer Shemais Kasav Diyesh Lichtov Chaser. The Sefer Shemais says you should write a Chaser. Vehevi Raya Midivei Ari. Shekasav Hillel Yom Said Rosh Rabbeinu V'Shneim Ba B'Yachtav B'Bei Shemais Shalayim Bei Seheim. Whatever, these are above my pay grade. And Kutzo, he somehow has some Kabbalistic thing from the Arizal, and basically he says you should write it chaser. Then he brings down that the Marit says like this, and the Beis Yosef and Bedek Abayis, and then he says Azoi. This is the Beis Shmuel. Hazam vas ubesram ubetaz pasku kipsak shulchan aruch diyesh luchlev malay v'chein iker gam b'mavata hukilu hayam malay. So he says. So first he's bringing the Beis Shmuel is bringing from Shulchan Aruch. He's bringing from the Marit. from the Beis Yosef, from the Sefer Shemos. That Rizal one way, and then he says no. But Lamaisa later Paiskim, the Zam and the Sam and the Taz say what's going on. What's going on in Klali Epsak? Okay, but now who is the Zam and the Sam? So, if you remember last week, one of the earliest sources that was a makar for the Beis Shmuel was a Sefer Zechariah, Talmud Muvak of who? The Ramon the Marshal. So, in his Sefer on Chumash on Rashi, in Parshas Kiseitze, he puts in an encyclopedic list of names, and he paskins like that. So, he's earlier than the Sefer Shemos, and he brings down to write it like that. So, he wants to paskin like him. Ubesam, who's the Sam? So, he said, if you open up your Shulchan Aruch, there's the Seder Gittin of Ramichel, dying under Taisus Yantis Bezdin. So these later Achrayim, they went like that. So that's what. So Beis Shmuel paskins like who? These later sources that he had from, and you basically should write it Mali. But what's fascinating is, you see here, some people would say, 1 second, let's read this carefully. He's going against Rizal and the Beis Yosef and the Marit for these three people. So obviously this is a much greater question. We're not going to go into right now. Now, as I said, Hilchas Gittin, and we said this last time, has endless amounts of material. Turns out, this topic, the amount that one could write on just how to spell Hillel, Meshunadik. There's another Maril. Up till now, according to Maril one way, there's not a Maril, but this Maril only came to light in the 1970s from manuscript, and it seems to be completely differently, not like the way the Maril, a different Mamish in Gans and Andish, but also handling the same psukim and shayftim. Now, what's going on? It turns out like this. You open up your Shulchan Aruch, you're looking at your Shulchan Aruch very carefully, and everyone knows there's a Yid on the Shulchan Aruch, the Vilna Gaon, has a sefer called the Bir Hagra. State in Bir Hagra that he's referring to the Psak of Rabbi Yaakov Margolis, based on B'Shem de Maril, that he's brought down on the pages of Shulchan Aruch and the Bir Haggaila, based on the pasuk in Shayftim, where someone wanted to bring a raya from Messiah. Says the Vilna Gaon, he doesn't have a blasted clue about the sugi of Messiah. He doesn't know how to read the Messiah. And then he says, the Vilna Gaon says, you have to learn ripe shot and how to read the Messiah. And the Gra makes a suggestion and says how to read it. And then it says even further. He says he has a different point. It's always chaser. And then he says, okay. Basically, the Vilna Gaon says, like the psak of who? The Bedek HaBayis, which was, you got to understand how to read, you're reading the Messiah wrong, and what? It's chaser. Now then, the Vilna Gaon, what makes the Vilna Gaon the Vilna Gaon? He says like this, when Messiah Ketana in Tehillim Yud Chaf, it talks about Hillel also. And over there we see Taka that Hillel is spelled Chaser. What does this mean? So I said you have to have a vast knowledge of Tanakh. So you open up your Tehillim Perek Yud Pasuk Gimel, over there it says Hillel Rasha. And over there, Taka in the Messiah, it says that's how it's spelled, with a Hillel with Chaser. So this is the Psak of Vilna Gaon. So you see here, the Vilna Gaon, not, first of all, he's saying a very sharp thing. You have to know how to read the Targ, the Messiah. Vilna Gaon saying, I do. He's suggesting that there's a mistake. It happens to be, if you'll open up your work, wherever work you have. So I was using my from the 1500s, where the first place where the Messiah was published. There's nothing in Shayftim there. So it's interesting over here. This whole deal of how to spell Hillel about Shayftim that the Pais can bring down in our Messiah, as far as we have from printed, doesn't even exist. Anyway, fine. But the Vilna Gaon says, but we have a Messiah Ketana. Also, this relates the same as the same type of chibur as Messiah Gdoila, whatever, not getting into differences. And over there it says often in Tehillim that it's spelled Hillel Chaser. Okay. Obviously, there's two other psukim. There's a pasuk in Yeshayahu, there's a pasuk in Zechariah where Hillel spelled with the yud. Okay, we're not, as I said, I'm not going into over here. There's a fascinating amounts of Marmakaimis. There's there's a beautiful piece in the Get Pashot. There's a fascinating, I said the Maril. There's a Rabbi Yaakov Emden. I can't. I have Rachmanus on everyone, but I can't list out everything. Okay, so now I just want to so now we're going to go back to explaining Yalag a few more, and to get closer to the end. And it's like this. So now we understand. When he's talking about the Arizal, we know the Beis Shmuel brought in the Arizal. Where's the source of the Arizal from the Beis Shmuel? We're going to discuss in a minute. The Bedek Abayis, now we know. And now we know what the Rosh Teva Zam Vasam is. The Zam is the Zikr Moshe, and the Sam is the Seder Gittin of Reb Michal, Seder Michal. Okay, so basically, we identified who Yalag was referring to in this poem of his, in this Svarim on Hilchas Gittin that he's referring to. And Amir Tashem, time has run out, so we have Rachmanis. We're just going to clarify briefly a few points related to this in the next episode, and to conclude with what Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern held about this topic, because we're going to see how full of baloney Yalag was really. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Rabbi Dr. eliezerbrodt. That was a fascinating episode, teaching us about people, good people, lahavdil, bad people in the previous generations, and we're looking forward to more on the next episode. And the new Sefer, what's going to be the new Sefer? We'll do that in the next episode?
Amir Tzashem, because it relates to what we're going to talk about.
Okay, looking forward to part 2 on Yalag and lahavdil Rabbi Yosef Zechariah Stern.